It's a slushy Monday morning on the Housatonic Railroad when the morning's NX-12 plows through the piles of snow left by the plows from when they plowed the roads earlier that night. Today's NX-12 has 3 GP38 leasers for power today, one of which will be dropped off into Milford for the NX-10. The NX-12 also has 37 cars in tow today, 28 of them being Oak Ridge C&D gondolas that will be stored and spotted at the south end of the line. After the first pass, we move south to the Merwinsville Hotel when the NX-12 passes by in the slushy, wet snow. Making our way into New Milford, we reposition onto River Road as the NX-12 continues south at 10 miles per hour. Just south of New Milford Center, the headlights of GMTX 2328 are seen, passing by the former station and into New Milford yard limits, where they'll interchange with the NX10. As the NX12 and the NX10 worked in the Milford yard, we parted ways for breakfast. And as the NX10 was heading out into Milford, the NX10 with the 2346 ended up having mechanical issues. Which brings us to where we are now, with the NX12 heading through Harrybrook Park to rescue the broken down NX10. Once tied onto the NX-10, the NX-12 tows the NX-10 north back to New Milford, where they can swap power and begin the work that is ahead of them. As both crews head back to New Milford, we hold our ground at Harrybrook Park, and after a 20-minute wait, the NX-10 is heading south once again, this time with the former Bangor and Aroostook GP7U number 22. The Housatonic Railroad locomotive, 22, is the oldest yet toughest locomotive on the Housatonic roster. Built in February of 1952, the locomotive was first owned by the Santa Fe Railway, built as a standard GP7, until it was bought by the Bangor and Aroostook and rebuilt into a GP7U. In 2003, the B&A was officially bankrupt and the railroad was incorporated into the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, where the 22 spent a short amount of time until being sold to the Housatonic Railroad. As the NX-10 clears Harrybrook Park, we head south to the Brookfield New Milford town line, where the NX-10 can be seen slowly crossing over Old Middle Road. As the NX10 crosses into Brookfield, we reposition at 4 corners, as the NX10 continues south at 10 miles per hour. At Junction Road, the NX10 can be viewed crossing overhead as the distance from Berkshire Junction continues to close. At Vale Road, the NX10 is on its final approach to Berkshire Junction as they head down the straightaway and around the curve through Farmco. At Berkshire Junction, we arrive just in time to see the NX10 begin their work, as they come to a stop and then pull ahead of the siding that currently holds stored Farmco loads. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 backs down the cars containing ethanol and alcoholic beverages onto the siding that holds the rest that await unloading. Once tied onto the stored cars, the NX10 continues to shove the loads further into the siding, far enough where the cars can continue to wait until unloaded at Farmco. Once the loads were spotted on the siding, the NX10 pulls back ahead of the switch to realign it and then tie on to the rest of the Oak Ridge empties. Once tied on, the NX10, with the 21 remaining cars, pulls ahead of Berkshire Junction and off the Berkshire line. Once ahead of the switch is realigned and the NX10 shoves the 21 cars up the Maybrook line and ahead of the siding that is mainly used for storing Oak Ridge gondolas. Once ahead of the siding, the NX10 aligns the switch, heads engine's light onto the siding, and then realigns it back for the main, as the 21 cars begin to slowly make their way down the grade of the Maybrook line. Once the 21 cars were clear of the switch, the NX10 heads back out of the siding, and once the switch is lined, back onto the main, to tie onto the rear end of its train and continue their work at Berkshire Junction. Once tied onto its train, the NX10 cuts 8 of the 18 gondolas and shoves them onto the siding for storage. Once on the siding, the NX10 heads engine's light back onto the main, to tie back onto its train and then head west to Oak Ridge. Along Federal Road, we stop to see the NX10 shoving their train west to Oak Ridge, to make its drop off and then head east to Lakeland and Chippewa. as the NX-10 made their drop at Oak Ridge, we would reposition to Hollyville Road, located across the road from the Chippewa Reload, where the NX-10 can be seen making its way east, with 1 load for Lakeland and 2 for Chippewa. From Hollyville, we continue our way east into Newtown, located by the former station, as the NX-10 continues with no trouble at all. In the eastern part of Newtown, we arrive at Lakeland Lumber, where a few minutes later, the headlights from the 22 can be seen, as the NX-10 rounds the bend towards the east end of the siding. Once at the east end, the NX-10 cuts the 22 from the consist and pulls ahead of the switch to run around their train. Once ahead of the switch, the NX-10 proceeds down the siding to the west end. From there, they'll realign the switch back onto the main, and then proceed east on the main to tie onto the rear end of their train. After about 12 minutes, the NX-10 with the 22 is seen once again, backing down onto the rear end of their train. Once tied on, the NX-10 shoves the 3 cars to Lakeland Lumber to begin their work by dropping 1 car into Lakeland. Due to inactivity on this portion of the line, the crossing that guards Lakeland is no longer in operating condition, forcing the conductor to flag the crossing before crossing over and beginning their work. The NX10 will also have to do a little switching before they can drop and go, as the one center beam bound for Lakeland is located in between the two cars bound for Chepaug. Once the boxcar was settled on the main, the NX10 pulled ahead of the Lakeland switch once the crossing was flagged and protected. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves the one load down into Lakeland Lumber. Once the one load was spotted in Lakeland, the NX10 heads back out onto the main and ahead of the switch to tie on to the other Chepaug-bound car and head back westbound for Chepaug. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves back to tie onto what remains of its once 25-car train. Once tied on, we head back to the former Newtown station to witness the NX10 head back west to continue their work on the Maybrook line. As the NX-10 rounds the bend at milepost 87, that would conclude this day on the Housatonic Railroad. And as always from the weathered rails, thanks for watching.